Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Elephant in the Room Stands Bite-Sized podcast series. I'm Kat, and I'll be your student host for the series. We aim to create space for honest conversations around topics that are possibly uncomfortable and intimidating to address, but are too important to ignore. Our goal with this series isn't to have all the answers, and we won't pretend to be perfectly neutral either. But we have invited expert voices who share Stan's commitment to global justice, equity, and sustainability. Some of what you hear may challenge reviews, and that is okay. We would love to hear your thoughts, so join the conversation and let's keep exploring these complex issues together. In this episode, The Elephant Still Living in a Spare Room, we talked to Rory Hearne about the Irish housing crisis and how it's affecting students and young people. Rory shared that in the past 15 years, there has been a massive increase in what he referred to as generation rent and generation stuck at home. Having to face the grim possibility of not being able to afford rent or a home, many young people feel that their mental health is impacted negatively, such as increased anxiety, decreased self-esteem, and lack of hope for the future. Rory shared insights on what some other countries have done to curb their housing crisis and possible solutions for Ireland. Let's get into it. So over to you, Rory.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So from your research, what have you found in terms of the impact of housing crisis on young people, specifically about mental health or like students having to commute and teachers and also immigration?
Yeah, so the housing crisis in Ireland is something that a lot of people have heard about. A lot of people, and I'm sure some of your listeners too, are actually living through it. And as you named, some of the groups hardest hit by this crisis have been younger people and younger generations. But increasingly, it is people across the generations are affected. We've seen, an increase in, for example, people over 65 who are in homelessness. We've seen an increase in older people who are stuck renting in the private rental sector, living in insecurity. But it is true to say that the research that I have done and the work that I have done has shown that young people have been hit the hardest. And that is because what we've seen in the last 15 years in Ireland is this shift from what used to exist was people would be able to own their home and buy a home, or people lived in what we would call council housing or social housing. But what has happened since then in the last 15 years is we've had the emergence of what I've called generation rent. This is young people who are stuck renting in the private rental sector, can't get out of it, they can't get somewhere to buy, and so they're stuck in situations where they're paying very high rents. They're in situations where into their 30s and even into their 40s, they're sharing with strangers basically in their situations. And then we also have this new kind of group in our society, which are these adults who are stuck living in their parental home. What I called generation stuck at home. Other people have termed them generation box room. And they are stuck living in effectively their childhood bedroom. And we have seen a very, very significant increase in the number and proportion of young people who are stuck in this situation into their 20s, 30s, unable to either afford to rent or unable to buy their home. And you asked about impacts. The people I've spoken to and I've spoken to them extensively in my research, but also on my own podcasts that I've covered and have written about them. And they've sent me their experiences. And that's been kind of one of the big things over the last couple of years as I've spoken out on this issue, that a lot of people have sent me their experience. And what I've seen is a huge mental health impact. People ranging from, people with anxiety, increased anxiety, sense of really impact on their sense of self, their sense of self-esteem, sense of personal failure, and, worry about the future. And there's many of different situations that people are in, and there's no doubt that it has had a very significant impact on people's well-being and their sense of hope about the future. And we're seeing, as a result, increasing numbers of these young people emigrating, leaving the country, because they don't see a future where they can get a home in this country.
Thanks so much for sharing, Rory. It could see, it seems from what you share is that it's not just the physical fact of not being able to get a home, but it also impacts psychologically on a lot of people, especially young people. And so on to the next question. What is the situation regarding homelessness like?
Yeah, so homelessness now in Ireland has reached record numbers in the last 10 years again. And the kind of crisis started, and I remember highlighting it at the time back in 2014, which is 10 years ago, was the first emergence of families and children being made homeless and going into emergency accommodation. And I remember the time supporting some of the first parents who marched in Dublin to try and highlight their issue. At that point, we were talking maybe 800 to 1,000 children with their families in homelessness. We're now today over 4,500 children in homelessness in various forms of emergency accommodation with their families. Huge increase in numbers. And there have been, it's a lot of it is talked about homelessness as being complex. We heard the government, even the Taoiseach Simon Harris, blaming, increased immigration. We see the Minister for Housing blaming, complex reasons for homelessness. But the reality from the research and organisations who work on homelessness, like Focus Ireland, shows that the majority of people are made homeless because they're evicted from the private rental sector, not for anything they've done, but simply because the private landlord is selling the property. And in Ireland, unfortunately, tenants just don't have the rights that they have in other European countries, and they can be evicted even if they're doing nothing wrong, even if they're paying the rent. And what we see is the main cause of homelessness over the last 10 years has been people being evicted from the private rental sector and then having nowhere to go to, essentially. Many go into what we call hidden homelessness. And I did a report last year on this specifically, this issue of hidden homelessness. And we really don't know how many people are living in that situation, because when we talk about homelessness, in general, we're talking about people who are in different forms of emergency accommodation, whether that's hostels, hotel rooms, or what are called these family hubs, which are essentially new forms of institutions. They are situations where they're often they're even in warehouses. They can be part converted hotels, and they're situations where you would have a family sharing one room. For example, mother, the parents, two children might be sharing, 3 beds in a small room, and then they share the kitchen facilities with maybe 3 or 4 other families. And these are situations that are not suitable for children to be growing up in. And again, I've researched and highlighted the psychological impact on children, the developmental impact on children, where, for example, how do they have birthday parties? Where do they bring their friends for play dates? These are really important things for children, and they're being denied it in these situations. It's a complete denial of their basic human right to housing. And I've been highlighting it year after year. We've seen homelessness grow, and yet our government and state institutions have failed to properly act to prevent it.
What do you think are the key issues to the crisis? As you have also mentioned, like the issue with private landlords and the tenants not having their rights when it comes to the renting situation. So can you expand a little bit more on that and maybe give insights on how we can solve this?
Yeah, absolutely. It is important that there are solutions and there are things we can do, and that's really important to give people hope. People say that the housing situation in Ireland, the crisis, is very complex, and unfortunately, I'm hearing increasingly people saying, "Oh, it's just you can't fix it." But in order to solve it, we have to really understand, what caused it and what are the causes. How did we get here? How did we get to this point? We didn't just land at this spot. It wasn't like the housing crisis just arrived here from the moon. It had causes. There was reasons why we got here. It wasn't a natural disaster that caused the housing crisis. It wasn't some, thing that just came here. It resulted from specific policy decisions. And I talk a lot about this, about the importance of understanding, government decisions, Department of Housing decisions, decisions by private developers, investor funds, landlords, that all these different decisions and things that people do, the different, what you would call kind of actors or institutions involved in housing, the different decisions that they make and what they do and how they approach housing all impact on how we are here today. And I suppose for me, the fundamental cause ultimately is the shift away from the delivery of council housing by the state, by local councils in the 1980s and 1990s in Ireland, that really continued through the austerity period of the 2010s, and during the Celtic Tiger period as well. The idea that the market, private developers, builders would provide housing, and that essentially treating housing as a commodity, as this investment asset where property prices would keep increasing, and that we no longer wanted to provide social housing. For me, that's the fundamental cause, and we shifted to provide social housing as well through the private rental sector, through subsidies to landlords. And this again left people who used to get stable, secure council housing now living in the insecure private rental sector. And that again leads back to that cause of homelessness. And we see these policy interconnections. And also then the other big kind of policy, decision, and it wasn't a mistake, it was on purpose, was this shift to institutional investors or corporate landlords or vulture funds to provide housing. And now we see a situation in Ireland, for example, last year, where of the new apartments that were built, 6,500 were bought by these corporate landlords, and there was only around 800 bought by individuals. And we see that this huge issue in Dublin now, where there's lots of apartments being built, but none of them are available for people to buy. And so we really see this locking out of a generation by this preferential treatment of institutional landlords, corporate landlords. And ultimately, as you mentioned earlier, then that is also connected back to the failure of governments to provide tenants protections. We don't have proper tenants' rights, renters' rights in Ireland. We haven't been. Private renters have been treated as essentially second-class citizens. Again, linked back to this treatment of housing as an investment asset, and the housing policy decisions have been made to benefit and in the interest of landlords who own properties rather than the renters.
So as you mentioned, it's a lot of the problems kind of lie in the sort of like corporates, the government institutions, but then what can the people do, like as normal citizens?
Yeah, I've always advocated that, there's a lot that people can do. It might seem very difficult to influence these things or to change them, but people always have a power to influence things. And we've seen that down throughout history, that things change through things like the civil rights movements, through boycotts, through people protesting. Things do change. And throughout the course of history, when ordinary people have got active, when they've come together in groups, whether in political parties or trade unions or community groups, they can achieve real change and influence things. And I think it's similar in the housing situation. And, we've seen, for example, at a grassroots level, we've seen there's a new tenants union called Community Action Tenants Union. CATU in Ireland are helping and organising tenants and supporting renters in terms of dealing with landlords. People can get involved in groups like that. And there's an election coming up, and there's a real possibility again that people can, say when politicians come knocking at their door, that the issues that concern them are housing and homelessness, and talk about what, because government will say we're doing this, we're doing that. But the reality is, as I said, that we need solutions like greater protection for renters from eviction, for example. Why, I've proposed that there should be a ban again on evictions, that people can't be evicted into homelessness. So I think a question to ask politicians is, why aren't you implementing that ban on evictions that would stop people being made homeless? Another area is the delivery of affordable housing by not-for-profit housing providers and the state itself through local authorities. through areas like public construction, that there's areas we can do, like through the Land Development Agency, could be building up construction skills, that the state itself would have the capacity to deliver housing. For example, as well, there's factories that build housing across Europe. Why can't we be setting up factories to fast build housing here? There are a lot of solutions. And of course, I think stopping the vulture funds buying the apartments as well, and ring fencing half of those apartments that are being built for people to buy affordably, to rent affordably. And ultimately, we do need to deliver kind of this broader, like what they do in Austria and the Netherlands. They deliver public housing for a range of income groups. And we should be doing the same thing here, making public housing available for lots of groups. That's public housing to rent and public housing to buy as well.
So actually there's a question kind of related to what you have talked about, like you sort of like bring up the solutions that other countries already been doing, and Ireland can possibly adopt that. However, they don't, why don't you think they adopt this or have adopted this yet?
I think that it's very straightforward that the interests and these kind of different actors I referred to earlier have influenced policy, have been largely the investor funds, landlords and private developers. And the question is, well, why? Why have they got such an influence, and why is government doing what they want? And essentially it comes back to the government hasn't believed in or proposed developing the state capacity to deliver. So if the state or councils or not-for-profit housing bodies, they don't have the capacity to deliver because the state hasn't invested in it. So therefore you're completely reliant on the private market to deliver. So in a way, the investor funds and the developers have us, in a way you could describe like over a barrel, or that there's this kind of monopoly that they control. And government, rather than developing a public capacity or a not-for-profit capacity to deliver housing, they have left housing in the hands of the market, which has essentially meant that they're constantly trying to do what the market wants in order to increase supply. But that just leaves you in a vicious circle of ever more expensive housing and a lack of real public housing.
Thank you for sharing. We have another question. So it's related to the elections. When it comes to the upcoming elections, which party do you think has the most viable solutions? Can you give some pros and cons of the different parties' responses?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say that if you look broadly at the government's policies, that they are very much, as I've described, they are pro-market, they are pro-investor fund, pro-developers, and they don't really have an ambition to develop public housing on the scale that's required, or affordable purchase housing on the scale required. There's a real lack of approaches that will deliver that. It's essentially continue as we are and hoping to incentivize the market to do it differently. The Social Democrats, for example, which I am standing for and will be standing for in the election, propose something very different, which is developing that public capacity, that not-for-profit capacity to deliver housing. And also, as I mentioned earlier, things like giving renters proper real protections, freezing rents and treating housing like a human right. And I think that that's really the direction we need to go on. Housing is a human right. I think we need a referendum to put it in the constitution. That is a real change that could be made. And it's I think that the overall sort of direction we're going is not one that's going to solve the crisis at the moment.
Thank you for sharing. I really like the point where you said making housing the human right, because it's supposed to be for everyone, not just the ones who have the money or like capacity privileges to afford it. And just quickly, one final question. So this is directly for the students. Do you have any tips for them, specifically those who are looking for accommodation?
Yeah, it's really, really difficult. For students, and I actually, should have talked a bit more about the students, because of course I see it in my lectures, and I've spoken about this before, and speak to students obviously on a daily basis in terms of that. The housing crisis has had a massive impact on students, particularly those commuting. Again, that generation stuck at home. There's many who used to, and in the past would have travelled or gone away to university for education and experienced education third level as a much more broader college experience, but are being denied that now, and many of course are being impacted. It's inequality of access. It's worsening those students who can't afford accommodation, are commuting longer, they're more tired in lectures, they might be working as well. Their educational experience is reduced as a result, and that's a huge inequality, and it's impacted by the housing crisis. But also the government has promoted investor funds in delivering student accommodation and turning students into a commodity. But I think for students accessing accommodation, like student unions are often really, really helpful. They're good places to go to get support. And I would always encourage students to go to their students' unions and get involved. And it's a way of meeting other students and making networks and trying to get change. But also then you will find out what's available. The student welfare officers are usually really, really good for that.
Thank you so much, Rory, for your input. It's very insightful, and yeah, I do know more about housing now than I did before. Hopefully everyone else also. And if you want to engage more deeply with pressing social issues, please consider joining our deeper dive and interactive global issues course. You can find more information on our website, www.stand.ie. And we also have a lot of ongoing and upcoming projects, so do keep your eye on the website.